that you're also interested in. We're talking about drugs.
Yay.
Page 162.
Yeah.
You should be opening your book to 162 because you're such good students. You listen to everything I add. Okay, so what's the deal with drugs? It's interesting that drugs can have such big effects on people. So, and you know, you hear drugs are bad, drugs are bad. Well, drugs aren't all bad. I mean, people take drugs to, you know, stop aspirin. That's a drug. That's not so bad. I mean, you might need it to get rid of a headache. Certainly, all the anesthesia type drugs that allow them to do surgeries, I mean, that's incredible. It's amazing what they can do. So you don't feel pain, you know. It would be real tough to do a heart surgery if there was no anesthesia. Could you imagine? I don't think you could survive such a thing. So, when we're talking about drugs, we're not just talking about the drugs that, you know, are done at parties, you know. We're talking about all kinds of drugs. In all cultures, people have found ways to produce altered states of consciousness. We're also interested in these psychoactive drugs that change your states of mind and feeling. Even animals in the wild find and use drugs. That's something interesting that not everybody knows. Have you ever heard of catnip? Catnip is a drug that causes cats to get a little bit stoned, and they will seek it out because it feels good to them. And they will choose that over food in experiments. They'd rather do the drugs than do food. And there were some experiments carried out in the 60s and 70s that showed that given a choice, rats in a cage, it's called a Skinner box, and we'll learn about it later. They hit one, tap one thing and they get food or water. Tap this one and they get cocaine. And they'll choose the cocaine over the food and water, even to the point when they're starving. So it must be a pretty powerful drug to cause them to want it that bad. So how does it work? How do drugs work? Well, they act on neurotransmitters. Most of them do. And so we need to go back and look at what neurotransmitters are. Wait till Spunky finds out I got him catnip and the Christmas tree's all torn up. The cat wants drugs. No?
Wait, so you're actually buying drugs here?
I guess so, yeah, if you buy catnip.
Humans?
A lot of those scratching posts have it catnip built in. Anyone here on cat?
So it's like a punching bag with marijuana.
Yeah. Be on that thing all day. We got 4 categories of drugs, 4 choices, multiple choices. Stimulants raise the central nervous system activity. Cocaine, caffeine. Anybody have coffee this morning? You were doing drugs.
Yay.
Tobacco, amphetamines. These are all stimulants. And I know that you learned these in health class way back when. You've been, they bring this up all the time in school, so we're not going to spend that much time on this. Depressants somehow slow central nervous activity. Alcohol and tranquilizers, those are considered depressants. They slow everything down. Opiates are pain relievers, like heroin and morphine. Somehow they get rid of pain. And psychedelics disrupt the normal thought processes. LSD, mescaline, and marijuana can change the way the signals are sent and the way you think. LSD can cause you to see things that aren't really there, or hear things that aren't really there. And so can a lot of other ones. And a lot of these drugs can fall under multiple categories. Alcohol is a depressant in most. It can also be a stimulant at some times, depending on the person. And there are drugs that act as both as stimulants in one person and depressants in another. You can have drugs that cross lines between both. And you can have drugs that are both depressants and psychedelics. Can be both. Depends both on the central nervous effects, and the behavior and mood of the subjects is important too. Alcohol could be a depressant, drinking alone, and a stimulant, drinking with friends. And that all depends upon the situation you're in, not necessarily the drug itself. So the psychology of the situation is important, which you'll read about tonight, and I'll talk a little bit about. It's an antacid, you see. The ant is saying, whoa, I can see the air molecules. Acid for ants. It's funny. I'll tell y'all what's funny and what's not. There are little people crawling all over me. Like ants crawling all over you. Y'all have had acid trips before, right? It was big in the 60s. I know they don't do it anymore. So how do these things work? Well, it all goes back to how the nerves work. Nerves communicate with neurotransmitters, which are chemicals. And so here we go. This is a neuron, like a cell body here of a nerve cell. And the nerve cell has extensions that go down and lead to other nerve cells. And you should have studied this in regular biology, and we'll talk more about it in this class. But did we already do this nerve cell in this class? I get my classes mixed up. Yeah, we did this. Whoops. So just back to this little video. I think I already showed it to you. This is a pretty good video showing how neurotransmitters work. So this is the end of one axon. And this is a dendrite on the next neuron.
When a nerve impulse fires down an axon, it eventually reaches a synapse, the narrow gap between two neurons. Here, the action potential triggers the release of special chemicals that quickly diffuse across the synapse. These chemicals, called neurotransmitters, bind to protein receptors on the adjacent neuron. This opens channels which trigger a new action potential. In this way, the body transmits impulses between the many cells of our nervous system.
Okay, that's just kind of the basic overview of it. So here comes an action potential. That's a nerve signal coming down. And it's basically a nerve signal is the sodium ions rushing in and potassium ions going out. And it causes, just for a short time, a positive charge to be on the inside of the neuron. And that travels like a domino effect down the neuron. And eventually, you get the release of these neurotransmitters. Now, these are chemicals with a certain shape. These are usually often proteins. And proteins are globular molecules that have a certain shape. And that shape, when it combines with this receptor protein on the surface of the next cell, it has to have the right shape. It fits in there like a key fits in a lock. Bam. And now when it fits in there, this receptor receiving that protein changes the shape of this protein that's caught it. So this little Y-shaped protein that's called a receptor protein, it has a certain shape, you see. And so it's like when it catches the protein here, maybe it comes apart down here. Are you with me here? This is good biology, for AP biology. So pretend it catches the protein up here, and when it does so, it splits apart down here at the bottom. And that change in shape causes a change in the cell. And so here it's caught, and then all of a sudden that causes this big protein here to open up somehow. It's like a physical change that happens in the cell. This big protein opens up and allows ions in. Sodium ions come in, potassium ions go out, and that starts a new signal. So, how do drugs work? Michael, are you with me here? Well, drugs mimic the shapes of these neurotransmitters often. So you have to have a nerve signal go through your brain from your eyes to your occipital lobe of your brain to see anything. You don't really see anything until the nerve signal gets from your eye to your brain. And that has to travel through connections, these synapses. So if you take a drug like LSD, and I'm not exactly sure if LSD works this way, but if you took some drug that had the same shape as the neurotransmitter that causes the signal to fire to go to the back of the brain, you could take the drug, close your eyes, the signals would be firing still because the drug interacting with these receptors, and you would be seeing stuff even though your eyes are closed. And what you're seeing depends upon what what signals are being sent. And so often, people don't have their eyes closed when they're doing drugs. They have their eyes open, and so they're seeing other things that aren't really there. Sometimes the effect can look so real that you can't tell the difference between the illusion and what is actually there. There are people that have hallucinations, sometimes under drugs, and they'll see a person there, and there's no person there. And they see it just as real as a person that's there. They can't tell the difference between the two of them right next to them. Which is amazing, isn't it? But that's what the movie The Matrix is all about. They plug some guys into a machine. Everybody here watch The Matrix, by the way? Is that too old of a reference? They plug some guy in a machine and plug something into his brain. Remember, they just stuck it in the back, and it just activating his brain, and it was like he couldn't tell the difference between actually living. That was the whole Matrix. Isn't that cool? That's a cool idea. And it's theoretically possible if you could completely wire every neuron up and input signals to every neuron, you could do this. But the effect can be done with drugs. And drugs are kind of a general, usually a drug, if you take aspirin or something, it's a lot, millions of molecules spreading out, and where they interact usually goes through the entire body. And so just an aspirin might have an effect on damping. See, sometimes you can cause signals to be sent, and sometimes you can stop signals from being sent. What if you took a drug that has a similar shape to this, but not completely like it, where it might be able to land in the receptor, but not in such a way that it causes the receptor to change shape? Maybe it just kind of gets stuck in the receptor and doesn't completely activate the receptor. You see, some drugs have a shape where they just kind of get stuck in this receptor. and then the real neurotransmitters can't get in. What effect do you think that would have on the nerve if you took a drug that kind of would get stuck in the receptor?
Stop it from receiving signals?
It would stop it from receiving signals, and signals wouldn't be sent. So things like morphine that stops pain, that's kind of how they work. They get in these receptors and stop them from sending signals, and so you no longer send these pain signals along. So you inject some morphine into a patient, you can cut them right open, no pain signals are sent. All the receptors for sending the pain signals are blocked. Slap yourself in the face one time, that might help.
No, when I was listening,
It usually wakes you up. Activates pain sensors in the face. So, here's the problem with drugs. Let me turn the light on for this so you can see very well. So here we have the axon, and these are these little bubbles in here hold neurotransmitters, and they release the neurotransmitters. And here's the dendrite, and usually the dendrite doesn't just have one receptor. Like this going along. It has many. And so here's how people get addicted to drugs. This is good stuff to know. When they're teaching people not to do drugs, they should teach them the biology of it. That would be the most effective way to get people not to do drugs. Here's what happens. Michael, pay attention here. Why don't you pull your thing off? There you go. Very nice. So here's all these receptors, and every one of them can receive signals here. And so let's say that you're taking drugs, a drug that makes you feel good, a drug that matches the shape of these neurotransmitters and causes them. And so when you're taking the drug, here's the artificial drug here that you've been taking, and it's all over the place because you take so much of it. Let's say it's marijuana. Here's a bunch of marijuana molecules. I'm not exactly sure if marijuana works exactly like this. I mean, some drugs can cause the neuron to fire more and release more of this. And some drugs can cause the molecules, once the neurotransmitters, once they attach, to not come back out very quickly. So there's a lot of ways different drugs work. But let's say it's just a mimic drug, that it's got the same shape as this neurotransmitter. And so you take a bunch of it, and it starts binding here with all these receptors, and so this nerve is firing like crazy and going to one of the pleasure centers of the brain, making you feel good. And so you're getting all this pleasure, and you didn't have to do anything for it except smoke marijuana. And you're like, this is great. Now normally you get some pleasure whenever you do something that helps you survive, like whenever you eat, you get a little pleasure. Whenever you have sex, you get pleasure. Whenever you score a basket, you get a little pleasure. Instead of having to do something to earn the pleasure, you're just taking the drugs. And it's causing these things to fire along. Well, the body can sense when there's too much pleasure. The body has a way of sensing. And you know how the body reacts to getting too much pleasure? It goes... Anyway, anyone have any idea how the body might react to this to get it? There's too much pleasure around.
It kills those cells. It kills those cells that might.
It'll actually. You're close. What were you?
It'll stop me.
I was thinking that the body might release more dopamine, but.
It might counteract it by releasing something that causes these molecules not to work as much. That is a way it could do it.
Remove the receptor.
One of the things that it'll do is it'll start shaving these receptors off. It'll say, I'm getting too much pleasure signals. I must have too many receptors. The cell is kind of dumb. It doesn't know that well. And it'll start shaving off these receptors. And it'll start destroying them until it's getting the right amount of pleasure. So now this is now a pot smoker who's been smoking for several months without stopping. You'll probably know a few of those. And now, guess what? there's not nearly as much pleasure receptors here. So he's not getting as much pleasure. When he smokes the pot, it's not as much pleasure. Here's the kicker. This is why people get addicted. What if there happened not to be smoking pot? I know it's amazing for some of them, but here we go. Now they're not smoking and they're just out there on a normal day. Where are they going to get their pleasure from? They don't have they don't have hardly any pleasure receptors left. Let's shave it down even more for a big-time drug addict.
It's a great number.
They get no pleasure from anything. They eat, doesn't make them feel good. They have sex, doesn't make them feel good. The only thing that'll make them feel good is a massive bunch of drugs in here that are constantly stimulating the few receptors they have left. At high levels of toxicity, most of those drugs are deadly. They'll destroy your liver or kidneys or something like that, you see. And that's how people overdose. They do it so much, they shave off all their pleasure receptors, they can't get a good feeling from the drug unless they do a heck of a lot of it. Then they die from some side effect of doing a lot of a substance that's basically a poison. You see? And here's why they can't quit. When they're not doing the drug, they get no pleasure from everything. So their life feels terrible. Now the body will slowly start building these things back when it realizes you're getting no pleasure. But it takes months to get them all back where it used to be. So you have to go through life getting no pleasure for months at a time. When you know that taking the drug might get you a little bit of pleasure by overstimulating what few receptors you have left. And most people can't handle that. They can't wait for they can't go, and they say they're depressed, and they don't like their friends. And so how this usually manifests itself in the home is, you become a teenager like y'all, and this could be happening in your own life, probably is for some of you. You start doing drugs. Suddenly, you start shaving off your receptors. Suddenly, things that used to be fun for you are no longer fun. Like you might not want to hang out with your parents anymore. It used to be fun for you when you had more pleasure receptors, but they're pretty lame now. You might not want to go play ball anymore. It used to be fun to learn in school. When you learn something new, you get a little shot of pleasure for that. Did you know that? But guess what? After you do a bunch of drugs, the pleasure sensors are gone, learning isn't any fun anymore. So why study? Why learn? I'd rather be smoking pot. Let me go get high. Let me call my buddy. And so, this is what we see in teenagers as adults. We see students often suddenly hating school. They come in, I can often tell, they come in and they go, I hate this class. This is so lame. I don't want to learn any of this. And often that's because they're not getting any pleasure from it. Yeah, you do hate it. It's no fun. When if you weren't doing the drug, it would be fun. And so you get this question from a lot of people that are around your age. They might say something like this: so-and-so's totally missing out. They don't do any drugs. They don't drink. They're getting no pleasure. And it's not really true that way. You're actually everybody gets about the same amount of pleasure because your body regulates how much pleasure you can get. So a guy that doesn't do drugs gets pleasure from everyday activities like learning and making baskets and, having sex or whatever. And people who do a lot of drugs get the pleasure from the drug and not much from anything else. So the same people, all of us are getting about the same amount of pleasure. And it also explains why people who are in great suffering usually report that their life is just as happy as people who have it all. People who are real rich, they got all the money they want, and they get every food they want, and they have sex all day long, I guess. I don't know, I'm not rich. But they're just stimulating their pleasure sensors at everything they do, and they end up shaving their pleasure sensors off, so the real rich people aren't that happy, they report. And people who are poor, who are even in jail and tortured, you know, they hardly aren't getting any pleasures out of anything, so their body builds up a lot more pleasure sensors, and all of a sudden, you know, you give them a cracker, or you let them sleep for 2 hours, and that's wonderful. And they're like, yes. And so when they report how happy or sad their life is, you get about the same amount of reports from everybody across the board. Isn't that interesting? And it explains so much. Why people can't stop doing drugs, why people do drugs, why kids are failing out of school and stuff.
What about if someone's like outside of jail, and they're like used to like a certain standard of living, and then they go into jail? Does that mean like their perception of what gives them pleasure changes?
Yeah, well, yes. So for a while, so here's their normal amounts of receptors here. When they're out of jail, maybe they have a normal amount, and then they go into jail, and jail is terrible. So for a while there, they're hating it, yeah. And then they start building up pleasure receptors because they're not getting much pleasure, and so they might start feeling good about things that before they wouldn't have felt good about. Maybe the food tastes a little better after you're in there for a year. You see what I'm saying? So it does take some time to adjust. And then once the adjustment happens, then everybody's at about the same pleasure level.
What if you take like a torture victim who has like a ton of pleasure receptors, and give him some marijuana or something?
They would just love it.
Like would it be like too much pleasure?
Could be, yeah. Well, I don't know if you can die from having too much pleasure, but it would be great at first. And then, and this also explains why drugs are best when they're first done, and then they lose effect. And so, you know,
someone who does it once a month. Never mind.
This is something that you should know. You know, they say drugs are bad, drugs are bad. This tells you why drugs are bad. And tells you how you could die. This is how you should educate your children and think about your life going through. You know, this is, people get addicted to sex. You could imagine a sex addiction is the same thing. It's just like doing a drug. People get addicted to gambling. Every time you pull that thing, you get a little happy juice. But guess what? You get addicted and you keep going in and you get less happy the more you gamble. Doing a lot of anything is going to make it not as good. And it's always better the first time, and it gets worse after that. Isn't that interesting? So this is what you should know. That's our little drug discussion. And like I say, there's a whole lot, it gets a lot more complicated than this. There are drugs that activate these. There are drugs that when they attach, they cause signals not to fire. There are drugs that, there are enzymes, little proteins that after these molecules stick, they'll come out naturally. And there are enzymes that destroy them. They eat up the little neurotransmitters. After they do their job, the neurotransmitters leak out. There are enzymes that destroy them. So there are drugs that can attach to the enzymes and cause those enzymes not to tear up the neurotransmitter molecules. But again, it's all chemistry related. So it can get pretty. There can be several steps in here. There can be a drug that destroys the enzyme that tears up the neurotransmitter that attaches. I mean, it can go pretty far in advance.
Do antidepressants stop pleasure receptors from dying?
And they could either stop antidepressants could get pleasure receptors firing more, or they could stop pain receptors from firing. There's different ways they could work.
If a person is clinically depressed, would they have more pleasure receptors than other people then?
Well, you would think they would, but maybe there's something wrong with their brain chemistry, like they're not emitting enough neurotransmitters, and that's why they're depressed. Yeah, maybe they have built up, or maybe the mechanism they have for building these things isn't working. And often something like depression can be treated with drugs, Maybe if their problem is they don't have enough neurotransmitters, you give them a drug that mimics the neurotransmitter.
How do you figure that out?
That's what the psychiatrist's job is. There's all these different drugs out there, and they might try this one, and that doesn't work at all, so that wasn't their problem. They might try this one. You know, that's a very that's what you spend 10 years of school learning, how to figure out what drugs work. I don't know in particular, because I haven't studied that kind of stuff. But it probably varies with each type of person, with each case. Have you ever heard of the think-drink effect? This is an interesting experiment. Experiments have been done where people thought they were drinking liquor, but were not. And where people thought they were not drinking alcohol, but actually were. If you buy very fine, expensive vodka, you can buy vodka that has no taste. And if you pour it in something bubbly like club soda, you can't really tell that it's there. And so you can say, okay, you're going to be drinking club soda tonight. And they're actually drinking alcohol. They don't know. And you can say, you're going to be drinking alcohol. This is a screwdriver made with the finest vodka. You can't even taste it. And there's nothing in there but club soda. Wouldn't that be a cool experiment to do? People have signed up for this. You could do it in college, maybe. It'd be a fun one to sign up for. Results showed that men behaved belligerently when they thought they were drinking alcohol, regardless of the actual content of the drink. Belligerently means wanting to fight. So I give you club soda, I tell you it's alcohol, you'll want to fight, and it's just club soda. Because you think, yeah, this will make, hey, come on, I'll fight you. Dude, it's just club soda. Calm down. Both men and women report feeling sexually aroused when they thought they were drinking alcohol, regardless of the actual content of the drink. There wasn't much difference between the groups that were actually drinking alcohol and the groups that thought they were drinking alcohol. There wasn't much difference in the way they acted. Isn't that interesting? So the psychology of drinking is called the think-drink effect. If you think you're drinking, it's psychologically, it's almost just as good as drinking.
So you can get
Or as
yourself
bad
drunk
as
without any alcohol?
What's that?
So you can get yourself drunk without any alcohol?
That's right, if you think it's alcohol.
It's pretty
To some extent.
Okay.
Now, the experiment was only giving a couple drinks. It wasn't getting the people really drunk. Then there would probably be a lot more difference. But it is interesting that there was some behavior like that. Okay, I got a little bit.